Thank you. Okay, so my name is Pam McNerney. I am your event host tonight. Thank you for joining us to hear Amy Brady, the author of Ice, and she's in conversation with Jaime Green. Another fun fact about these two, Amy is from New Haven and Jaime is from New Britain, so both local. So tonight we will hear about the unexpected and unexplored ways that ice has transformed our nation, from the foods we eat to the sports we play to the way we live today and what our future might look like on a swiftly warming planet. So Amy is the executive director of Orion Magazine, and she's also the co-editor of The World as We Knew It, Dispatches from a Changing Climate, and she's made appearances on the BBC, NPR, and PBS. And Jaime is the author of The Possibility of Life Science, Imagination, and Our Quest for Kinship in the Cosmos. Okay, so after the event, books will be on sale at the register right out here. And after you purchase it, you can come back and get it signed, of course. Now I'm going to go get ice cream and you guys can get some. There you go. Thank you. Thank you so much. Keep clapping for the ice cream. Yes.
Yeah, of course they are. Well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you to RJ Julia for having me and Jaime here tonight. Thanks to all of you for coming out. I'm so excited to share some thoughts about my new book with you, and I hope you have lots of questions specifically about ice, because those are the ones that I can answer. And I thought that I would begin tonight by just very briefly reading a short passage from the introduction, because it talks about how I came to write about ice, which is admittedly a very specific topic to dedicate a book to. Okay. In America, ice is everywhere, in gas stations, restaurants, hospitals, our homes. Americans think nothing of dropping a few cubes in a tall glass of tea on a hot summer day. They fill large coolers with ice for week-long camping trips. They wrap ice in dish towels and press it to the skin of their bruised arms. They skate, race, and play hockey and curling matches throughout the year on indoor ice rinks. Parties end when the ice runs out. A 2020 poll conducted by Bosch reveals that 51% of Americans self-identify as ice obsessed, consuming up to 400 pounds of the stuff each year. Over 800 million refrigerators are sold in the United States each year, most of which have built-in ice makers. Yes, ice in America is everywhere, but it wasn't always this way. The nation's ice obsession is barely 200 years old, and until now, the story of how that obsession came to be has never been fully told. I know because I went looking for it. In the summer of 2018, a record heat wave gripped the planet, choking wildlife and straining energy grids. It hit when I was visiting family in my hometown of Topeka, Kansas. A series of rolling blackouts knocked out the air conditioner in my parents' home, so we piled into their car and headed to a nearby gas station, which was operating on a generator. Inside, a blast of cold air felt like bliss on my overheated skin. I headed for the soda dispenser and filled a cup with ice. As I watched the cubes fall, I was struck by an irony. I knew after a decade of reading climate science studies that heat waves like this one were consequences of climate change. The irony lay in the fact that I was driven to seek out and consume ice because of a phenomenon that's eliminating ice on the planet. For days, I mulled over this paradoxical connection between ice and climate, wondering how ice became so prominent in America in the first place. Much to my amazement, I couldn't find one comprehensive cultural history on the substance written for popular audiences. Every book I found discussed ice in terms of its scientific properties or as it relates to polar exploration. All of it was fascinating, but not what I was looking for. I realized I'd stumbled into a bona fide hole in history, and I wanted to fill it like that cup of gas station ice. For the next several years, I visited archives across the country, interviewed experts, and read everything I could about ice. At long last, a fuller history started to present itself, and it was stranger and more deeply entwined with other areas of American life than I ever could have imagined. So.
I think we just put it there in the middle. Okay. Well, they're recording it, so we need to make sure we're picked up. We definitely can reach the back of the room. So, make sure I can make you as well. So you wanted to read a book about it, and there's salt. And I remember like maybe 5 or 10 years ago, there's a big wave of these one-word title cultural histories, which I'm sure when you were figuring out the book, you like, but there wasn't one about ice, which is like mind-blowing. But not everyone who goes looking for a book and finds that it hasn't been written says, well, I'll write it. Like,
Right.
and obviously you are a writer, so it wasn't that long a walk, but like, what made you the sort of person who could say, this book doesn't exist, let me go to the archives and write it? Like, what prepared you for that? What led to this?
Well, I'm an avid coffee drinker, so I think that's a part of it.
Iced coffee.
Iced
Right, so
exactly.
I was gonna ask, does that mean that you have the energy for it, or that you have an affinity for ice, or both?
Yeah, both. I think I'm always very keyed up and
Yeah.
needing to do something with my hands. So why not type, right? But no, I've studied American history, my whole life. I did my PhD in American studies. I'm just fascinated by how American culture has been shaped and changed over time, but some of the most unexpected things. But when I knew there was a book about ice, it was probably when I discovered Frederick Tudor, who was the man who started the whole ice trade. I mean, this guy, he was a madman. This wealthy Bostonian who landed on the idea to cut blocks of ice out of his Massachusetts lake and sell them at a profit to people around the world in warm climates where ice didn't form naturally. And I found his diary. It's in an archive up in Boston. And as I was reading it, I was just like, who is this man? He tried to ship ice for 10 years. It was a failure. I can't imagine doing anything for 10 years and failing and sticking with it. But he kept at it. There's something very relatable about him, even though he was, clearly bent on, convincing the world to buy ice. There were passages in his diary where he showed a lot of self-doubt. At one point, he just writes the word anxiety in all capital letters. And I thought, I can relate to that.
Been there.
Yeah, been there. And once I had Frederick, I thought, okay, there's a story here.
And so you had that experience with the archives, and that was something you were familiar with. But we were talking earlier about how, I don't know, early on in your work, halfway, you suddenly couldn't access archives anymore.
Yeah, it was tough. I signed, I agreed to write this book right when COVID started to cast its first shadow in the United States. And, this book relied on a lot of archival research. There isn't a single archive that's just the ICE archive of the United States, right? So I had to go to a lot of different places, and I couldn't go anywhere. There was, of course, the lockdown issues, but also libraries were just like, we don't want anybody in here and I understand that. By the time we get to late 2020, early 2021, can I just say, like, thank goodness for librarians and archivists who, by that time, a lot of the archives weren't open yet, but I was calling them and I was like, look, I'm sure there's something in there I need. And they were like, we got you. And they went and looked, they scanned a lot of important documents and they sent it to me. They got on the phone, they helped you answer my questions. They're amazing. And this book, I dedicated to my husband, Alan, I love you, but I probably should have dedicated it to the librarians who helped me with this book.
And so it's not just archives research. You went places, you went to skating, like ice rinks and all sorts of, like, was that a new kind of reporting and research for you?
It definitely was. I had never been curling before. Now that is an experience, let me tell you.
Yeah. It's so much harder than it looks,
it's
right?
so much harder. Like so many people, I watched the American curling team at the Winter Olympics, and I thought,
Very slow.
yeah, of all the sports, in the Olympics, I could do that one.
And then what happened?
And then I get on the ice, and oh my goodness, it is so much harder. The way that they can gracefully glide, across the ice and send that rock down.
And not fall over.
And not fall over. I was on my back in seconds. It
Yeah.
was so hard. But really, really fun.
One of the things it's curling where the ice has to be, is the word pebbled, right?
Mhm.
So ice is such a fascinating substance, like scientifically, there's so much we don't understand about it. Part of that was it the curling stone that it's like scientists don't understand why it moves the way it does?
Yeah, yeah. Humans have been engaged in curling matches for centuries. This is not a new sport, but people still don't quite know how it works. So when you send a curling stone down a sheet of ice to get to the target at the end, that's how you play the game. The curlers kind of give the rock just a little bit of a turn so that it arcs along its path. Well, most things on Earth, when you give it a little bit of a turn to clockwise, it'll start doing an arc counterclockwise. That's just the way physics work. That's the way almost every single thing on Earth works, except a curling stone. When you give it a little bit of a turn to clockwise, it curves clockwise, and nobody knows how it works. It's that. Yeah, well, maybe, but there's something about the ice is what scientists think. There's something about the interaction between the friction of the stone and the pebbled ice that make the stone behave the way that it does.
There's something you write in the book, and I wrote the quote down, ice is weird. Which I think is a scientific statement, because there are other ways that ice is weird too, right? Like,
Yeah,
so many mysteries about how it glides, and also the fact that ice floats.
yeah,
That's a big deal, right? Like, we take it for granted because we see ice all the time.
yeah. I mean, a frozen version of the substance can float on the liquid version of it. It's a very strange thing.
Is there anything else that is the case for?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
But probably one of the weirdest things that I encountered is that scientists also aren't quite sure why ice is slippery. This is also really weird because, nobody puts on ice skates and then skates across, a granite countertop, which is also very smooth, right?
And it's solid, just like
And
ice.
it's
Like,
solid, just like
yeah.
ice. Yeah, it's only on ice that is achieved. Well, some scientists think, well, maybe it has something to do with friction, right? When you put your foot on the ice, the weight of it slightly melts the ice, making it a little more slippery. But that's not quite true. Anybody who has stepped outside their door onto a slick of ice, their foot immediately slides out from them. There's not enough time to generate that heat.
even if the air temperature is also below freezing.
That's
So it's
right.
not that the ice is melting.
Nope. No. What scientists are starting to think is that there's something going on with that molecular level at the very top that's somewhere between a solid and a liquid. They call it a quasi-liquid layer. In Utah, of all places, there are experts who are trying to kind of harness that weirdness of ice to make the slipperiest ice on Earth so that speed skaters can break records.
It's amazing to me that, like, we have so many, we have such an intuition for ice because we engage with it all the time. It's like, of course, ice is slippery. Of course, ice floats. If we don't stop and think about it, we don't realize how weird that is because it's so ubiquitous. But something that was so amazing to read because of that was the descriptions going back to Tudor, the first time that he brought ice to Cuba, that it was to people who had probably literally never encountered ice in their lives. Can you tell us how that went? Because, like, which is like, yes, you put ice in a drink, it's lovely to drink it, it's cold. But imagine, like, never having had a cold drink in your life.
Yeah, that's exactly what Tudor encountered when he first brought ice to Cuba. So before Tudor came to the United States and made us all obsessed with ice, he brought ice to Cuba and other places in the Caribbean because he was worried about copycat entrepreneurs. He thought, I want to first see if I can make this happen far away where nobody else can do it.
Paranoid.
Yeah, he was very paranoid.
It's kind of right to be paranoid.
He was right. He's right about a lot of things, and he's also crazy.
Mhm.
He started off in Cuba. And the reason why it took him 10 years before anybody actually bought him ice is because what he hadn't anticipated is that for people who had never seen ice before, they wouldn't just know what to do with it. So he launched one of the most outrageous marketing plans in American history. He said, like, ice is this aspirational luxury item that can completely transform your life, and let me show you how to do it. He took the mugs of warm rum that bartenders were serving in Cuba and showed them how to make things like mint juleps. He took the the milk and the sugar and showed them how to make ice cream. And once people got a taste for these things, they clamored for more, and he finally started to turn a profit.
Yeah, I mean, so let's talk about cocktails then, because the idea of being somewhere hot
Yes,
and
please.
sipping warm rum, not very appealing. But I hadn't thought, and I mean, everything in this book is just like, oh, I never thought of that, I never thought about how ice is everywhere in our lives, but how fundamentally a part of cocktails and the development of cocktails as a thing ice is. So people in the American South, in the Caribbean, didn't have ice. But in the North, in places where there was sometimes ice, people had ice houses where they could keep ice a lot of the year, right? But were they drinking cold cocktails, or was this all just like part of, because the next wave was in New Orleans, right?
Yes.
Where it's so savvy. So okay, sorry. I have too many cocktail questions. Ice and cocktails.
Ice and cocktails. So Frederick Tudor and other wealthy people who had access to ice in the North, they were putting ice in their drinks, sometimes to cool wine, sometimes to mix it with a little bit of mint, to make something refreshing. And so there was kind of an early version of an American cocktail happening, nothing to get excited about. But what happened around 1820 is that Tudor's people brought ice to New Orleans, and they used the same technique that they use in Cuba to get people hooked on ice. They showed the local bartenders how to make cocktails using ice and ice cream. But cocktails in particular took off, because what was already happening in New Orleans at this time is there were many immigrants and people from all different cultures and backgrounds that were already shaping and creating new types of art, new types of music, new culinary dishes. And so these were people who were very excited at the prospect of something that they could use to also make new types of cocktails. So within just a few years, bartenders were experimenting with different shapes of ice, shaved ice, crushed ice, things that could change the dilution and then, and by extension, the texture and taste of cocktails. And within a few years, we had the Sazerac, we had the gin fizz, we had the whiskey sour. We suddenly had American celebrity bartenders. And there was nowhere else in the world that this was happening. When people like Charles Dickens, for example, the English novelist, came to the United States, they just gawked at the amount of ice that Americans were drinking. There was one English critic whose name's escaping me, but he had written a lot about how, this new young republic, there are no aesthetes there. There are no artists. There are no musicians. And then he tried an American cocktail and he said, Americans do have an art form.
Oh my God. So you talk in the book about how it's like this particularly American obsession. Why is that? I mean, I'm thinking about how the country covers a lot of like geographic and climate space. So there are places where ice forms and places where it doesn't, but like, why is ice such an American obsession? Why didn't it catch on in like Europe like that?
I think it goes back to Tudor.
Really?
Yeah, so Tudor launched an ice trade before almost anywhere else in the world. And once he got it started, even after other ice trades began, there was none that was as large as the one that Tudor created. And Tudor's, innovation rather, was to get people hooked on drinking and ice and tasting ice. But also his innovation was to imbue ice with a sense of ambition. Ice was this kind of luxury item. It was something to strive for. And every time since Tudor that there's been a disruption in the ice industry, for example, the rise of mechanically made ice, so people don't have to harvest it anymore, or eventually the rise in electric refrigeration. Every time the people who were trying to sell their product copied Tudor and said, no, ice is this aspirational thing that you just have to have. So by the time we get to the 1950s, to own a refrigerator with an ice maker was on par with owning a TV set or a car. It showed that you had arrived at the American middle class.
And that kind of class mobility is something you don't really see in like England.
That's
There's
right.
there's no striving classes, just sort of where you are. So it is this like fundamentally American way of being and like trying to move through society.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You know, and I think today, if ice suddenly just became unavailable, God
Mhm.
forbid, right? So many areas that we think of as being distinctly American life just would cease to feel American anymore.
Like what?
There, I mean, not being able to put ice in your water. I mean, has anybody ever traveled
yeah.
through Europe and asked for a glass of ice water? You would look
You
like
might get one cube.
might get one cube if you're lucky.
And it's not the default at all. That's true. It's been a long time since I've been to Italy, but
Yeah.
that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so did ice cream start in the US? And then, 'cause now I'm thinking about gelato.
I mean, gelato is amazing.
Right.
Well, the history of ice cream kind of mirrors the history of ice in that it's riddled with myth and has multiple origin stories. Likely ice cream originated in many places around the world thousands of years ago, or at least versions of it. But ice cream became very, very popular in the United States because of ice, because of Tudor's marketing
Tudor.
plan. Yeah, but then what's really interesting about ice cream is that in the early, probably around the 1840s, 1850s, there was a man named Augustus Jackson in Philadelphia. He was a free Black man who had worked as a chef in the White House, and he had access to incredibly clear ice from a local lake, which was very rare. And he used that to make incredible ice cream. People in Philadelphia loved the stuff, so much so that he started selling it to other stores, and essentially created the first ice cream franchise in doing so. Around the same time, wealthy white people were opening confectioneries and ice cream parlors where most people couldn't go. But Black Americans, again, started opening their own ice cream parlors inspired by Augustus Jackson. And these ice cream parlors were open to other people of color and to white folks who couldn't afford the entry cost into these expensive confectionaries. And it's really thanks to those people that ice cream became so popular, because folks got their first taste of ice cream in these Black-owned establishments.
And then once you've had it,
And once you have it, you
imagine
can't
life
have it
without
all.
it.
Yep.
Which, as a reminder, we do have ice cream tonight. Please take it. Good. And then you told this, like, it's amazing how much class and striving is intertwined with ice. I was so struck by the story of the like not manufactured ice, but the manufactured ice shortage
Yeah.
in the tenements of New York,
Yeah.
where it at some point life had become so dependent on ice that it wasn't a luxury anymore. It was a question of whether it should be like a fundamental human right.
Mhm.
How did ice become so important that like the police were trying to like that it was like a political question of like, do people need ice, or like,
Yeah.
how did it become so important?
Yeah, well, by the time we get to the late 19th century, early 20th century, the cost of ice had fallen dramatically, so that
Mhm.
most Americans could have some ice sometime for many months during the year. And they became to rely on it to keep their perishables cold. Ice essentially replaced canning and salting, which was the only thing that was available. So ice was literally becoming a case of life or death. If you didn't have ice, you couldn't preserve your food. So the story that you're talking about is a wild story. So after Frederick Tudor, probably my second favorite figure in this book is a man named Charles W. Morse, one of the greatest American con men of all time. So this is a guy who bought up all of the ice companies in New York City and consolidated them into the Ice Trust. And since he didn't have any competition, one summer he just decided to hike up the prices by something like 10%, to where most people in New York, especially the people who lived in tenements, couldn't afford it. And he just blamed it on an ice shortage. Oh, it was too warm this winter and we didn't have enough ice to harvest. Well, that was kind of weird because in any other northern city in America, there was plenty of ice. So there was an investigation that went into it that revealed that it was a total lie. He was just trying to make a dollar on it, many dollars on it. But one of my favorite parts of the story, though, is that he did this during a famous heat wave in New York City, a heat wave that ultimately killed about 1,300 New Yorkers. And it would have killed a lot more if not for the quick thinking of a police commissioner. Now, the New York City Police Commissioner decided to take action when the mayor and New York governor did not. He looked around, he saw all this suffering. He ended up calling every, ice wagon that was available and said, look, we're going to load you up with ice. We're going to bring you into the tenements of New York and we're just going to give it away for free and try to save these people who were quite literally dying in the streets. So he did. And when people came out, they were crying in gratitude, shaking his hands, and just basically pledged their allegiance to him and said, like, if you ever have any political ambitions, we'll vote for you.
He was like, oh, what an idea.
What an idea. Well, that ice commissioner turned out to be Theodore Roosevelt. And in 5 years, he was president of the United States.
Wild.
Wow.
And lest you think that like you're hearing every amazing story from this book, like there are so many stories of just how ice is like intertwined with American culture and history, and just like it goes from, and the science, like we haven't even gotten into, I had no idea how like old manufactured ice was. Like I thought it was, a relatively recent technology. No, manufactured ice is hundreds of years old. We'll save that for the book because it's amazing. And you all can ask questions in a moment, but I have a
Yeah, we're
question.
at about 7:30, so maybe another 5 minutes of conversation,
Sure,
then
yeah,
we'll go to
certainly.
questions.
So as I was driving down here, I was drinking a Diet Coke and fountain, and I was appreciating the ice. And I was like, it really is everywhere. And I remembered that recently, and as an iced coffee drinker, this may be on your radar, Starbucks announced that they're changing their ice,
What?
to pellet ice.
Mhm.
Okay, so and pellet ice is a very polarizing topic. Some people love it. So for anyone who's not an ice head, what is pellet ice? What makes it special?
It's so special.
So you're pro
I
pellet
am
ice.
pro
Uh-oh.
pellet ice.
Oh, okay.
Helen Rosner and New Yorker. Pellet. Yeah, one's called pellet ice, just the good ice. Pellet ice it's what it sounds like. It's like tiny little pellets of ice.
It's what you get from Sonic.
It's what you get from Sonic. If you ever order, a
They're-
cherry
They're
latte.
little and they're not smooth. They're rough,
They're
right?
rough and they're crunchy. It's the kind of ice that you can chew on without hurting your teeth. It's very satisfying. It's an amazing stuff. A little more pixelated.
It's not quite as small. They're maybe like
Yeah,
large bean sized.
yeah.
And they are solid. It's not a slushy, but each one is a little rough. And so they're crunchy. And Starbucks announced that and people are so obsessed with pellet ice that they will have a pellet ice maker in their house to be able to have cups. Do you have a pellet ice maker?
I don't, but I have it on my wish
Success,
list.
you might fund the pellet ice maker. And so Starbucks is Starbucks doing like true pellet ice?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
here's my question. Doesn't that dilute your drink? That started.
Oh,
It does.
Isn't that potentially a bigger problem with coffee than with like a cherry, whatever?
Well, everyone's, miles may vary on this,
Mhm.
but here's the interesting thing about the science of ice, though, is that when you have more surface area of ice, yes, it dilutes it, but it also turns your drink colder much faster because of the laws
Yeah.
of thermal exchange.
And so then once that cold has happened, the ice isn't melting as quickly.
Well, it means in my case, it would mean the coffee's more delicious much faster.
That's true. So you have to drink it fast.
You would drink it fast, and I mean, that's in Starbucks best interest, right?
Right, no, that's what I was just thinking. It's very
Then I
savvy.
need another one.
Right,
Right,
right, that I can't sit and sip my one coffee for 2 hours. I gotta drink it fast.
Right.
So is pellet ice better for drinking or for chewing, or is it really great for both?
I mean, I'm a fan
This is so
of
interesting.
both of it, absolutely. Pellet ice is also really, really good in drinks that are extra boozy. You know, if you
Yeah.
get like a tiki drink, pellet ice is great for that because it does dilute the drink faster and it makes it go down a little bit easier.
Yeah,
Anyone who's ever ordered a tiki drink, if it's not filled with pellet ice, turn it back to the bar and say, I want a proper tiki drink.
and then they're gonna be like, we can have a pellet
They're
ice
gonna
maker.
have pellet ice, then change bar.
I was go down the street to the other tiki bar. I love the idea of like a strip with just like warring tiki bars. Because in the cocktail section,
We should have served cocktails.
You know,
I think we do.
we should have done both.
Just take out my flask, pour in my ice cream.
Tiki, we should have had a little tiki hut.
So, oh, man, yeah, now I was. I'm glad that I read this when it wasn't too hot out, because it would be so, you need something cool with this. So, and in terms of cocktails, and this gets a little into the science of it. You write about how it's not just that ice makes cocktails colder or dilutes them, but that it actually fundamentally changes some of like the flavor and texture experience.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there's this idea that when James Bond asks for shaken, not stirred, and it's like shaking makes the ice melt faster. So he's actually asking for a watered down drink. But
That's true. Yes.
but you also say that like shaking sort of almost emulsifies it a little bit. So it's not just that he's asking for a weak drink. He's got a
Yeah.
sophisticated palate.
He does have a sophisticated palate, absolutely. It emulsifies it. If you add egg white, it can create a foam
Yeah.
to the drink. And shaking also cools the drink much faster.
Yeah.
And what scientists have also learned is that when you have a drink that's very, very cold, it tends to hide some of the sting of the alcohol, which also makes ice cold drinks more palatable to many people than say a mug of warm rum that many people would have been drinking 200 years ago.
So let's jump to the audience for a
Yeah.
minute and see if anybody has questions, and if not, you can continue with your conversation. Does anybody?
But please do ask questions if you have them. We're not
Yes.
trying to.
I have the global warming question.
Yes.
So that's sort of two-fisted. I mean, there may be less natural ice, but ice is melting, but also should we be shifting our palates so that we aren't craving
No,
ice, and how do we go about that?
yeah, no, it's a question at the heart of my book is, can ice in our refrigerators and our planetary poles continue to coexist? The answer is, well, to be determined. But in terms of us as Americans, I will say, I don't think Americans are giving up our obsession with ice anytime soon. So something else is going to have to change. And the good news is that there are actually studies being done right now on new types of technologies that could replace the type of refrigerator that we have in our homes right now. And this is a great thing because refrigerators, as they're made now, are the appliance in our house that draws the most energy. And if it has an automated ice maker in it, it draws even worse. That's exactly right. Because ice makers never shut off. That's why you can have ice any time of day or night. But new technologies such as refrigerators that are built using magnets, others that are built using something called plastic crystals. These technologies are much more energy efficient. They also replace the refrigerants in our refrigerators that are also greenhouse gases that tend to leak as refrigerators grow older. And if we can scale up these technologies, then that could be transformative. And, in terms of the question of, well, can we scale it up? Well, again, to be determined, but I will say that in researching the history of ice, the one thing that I was most surprised of is just how quickly Americans adapt to new technologies and new appetites as soon as they're presented with the option.
I mean, we could go back to the old fill the tray with water and stick it in the freezer.
We could do that too.
That's how my fridge works. It happens, but then we do run out of coffee or run out of ice sometimes when I'm trying to cool off my coffee. And it hasn't yet led to me getting divorced, but. We'll see. Are there other questions?
So did Frederick Tudor just focus on the individual consumer and their appetites, or was he trying to market it as a way to preserve food and, refrigeration from that point of view?
In the beginning, it was just to get people hooked on
Yeah.
ice. So it was really about appetites.
Yeah.
But about 10 years, into the ice business, he became an entrepreneur of other kinds. He started to market his own brand of ice boxes, which were the early versions of the refrigerators where ice was kept. He also got into ice cutting tool development to make the cutting of ice easier. And that was actually a great innovation because even though there were other copycat entrepreneurs that bought his tools, it still led the way for more infrastructure so that more ice could be harvested and shipped across the United States.
Did your research know anything about ice being addictive?
Oh, about being addictive, like in a wellness sense?
No, just I have ice with me 24/7. When I told people I was coming here, they laughed. What do you need to know about ice? We read it all the time. I think I'm addicted to it.
Oh, that's so
You know,
interesting.
And I don't know whether it's psychological or whether there is an actual thing that you can do with. I love the taste of it. I love the crunch of it.
Yeah.
I sleep with ice by my bed and I try and sneak the cube so it doesn't wake my husband out.
And then once you crunch,
Yeah.
it's hard to crunch ice, pellet ice. Very
I know what's on your Christmas wish.
Right.
Pellet ice maker.
Pellet ice maker.
Well, because like chemically, it's just water. And water is addictive in as much as we do need it to survive. We are dependent on water.
Yeah.
So it couldn't be a chemical addiction, like it's true.
Probably not. I didn't look too much into ice.
I don't need to
addiction,
diagnose
but-
you.
You're excellent.
Maybe by next week, exactly. But there is something really interesting about what you're saying. There's a writer named Heidi Jalabitz who also wrote for the New Yorker about ice. And in it, she says, actually, I have a quote from her in my book. I'm going to read it for you because it gets to the heart of the psychology of this. She says that the American need for ice speaks to our obsession with refrigeration as an antidote to death.
Whoa.
And in this essay, she talks about how one of the reasons why Americans in particular are just so obsessed with ice is that we have this aversion to illness, to death, to rot, and we've come to associate coldness and ice with the opposite of that.
Oh, wow.
It's deeply embedded in our
Interesting.
psyches.
Wow.
So maybe it's just that you just don't want to get sick. So you
No.
keep your ice.
Or it's just. Feels nice.
It feels fine.
It seems like one of the least harmful
Hmm.
potential addictions, as long as your dentist is okay with it.
Your teeth, yeah.
Right, that's,
The
yeah,
Chewing and chewing of ice.
it's a little tricky.
Yeah, I mean, I've always heard you shouldn't chew ice, but I don't really know what it does to your teeth. Is it?
Well, it can break them, believe me.
Oh.
It's happened.
All right, we really have to get you a pellet ice maker.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I do know, I've encountered the idea that if you are like stranded out in the cold, you shouldn't just eat ice or snow because it can give you hypothermia. Like if you're thirsty, you need to melt it first. But that is not a like, no, you're like, I've got it, you're used to it. That's so interesting. Do you find that you're more comfortable in the cold outside now because of your ice addiction, or are you bothered by the cold?
No, I get cold
Oh,
easily, but it doesn't stop me from being nice.
Yeah, because you're saying you're cold all day today, but.
Yeah, yeah. But I have my ice.
other questions? I promise not to try to diagnose anyone's ice addiction.
I guess I'd be curious about, if there was anything small you wanted to hint at between, 1910, 1920 and the tenements, and then jumping in. I'm curious about like the anecdotes in between those years, like,
The 1910s and like the 19 now.
and the, yeah, right, because it's 2023.
Oh, like the sort of.
An ice story in the 80s or something.
Oh,
Just
yeah,
curious if there was anything jumping.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I've got a great story for you.
let's hear it.
So, there was a major ice company in Texas called the Southland Ice Company. And they were very, very popular up until about the 1930s, 1940s, when the natural ice industry had starting to wane, and the rise of the electric refrigerators was putting all kinds of ice out of business. But they were still selling ice from their stores. And what they noticed, because they're always looking for ways to try to keep business, since ice was on its way out. And some of the store managers noticed that when people would stop at their store after visiting a grocery store, they start to grumble like, oh, I forgot my milk, or I forgot my bread. And so the Salt and Ice Company managers thought, well, what if we start to store some of these staples alongside our ice, so that when people stop to pick up ice, they could also pick up their milk or their bread and just make it a quick trip. And it was hugely popular. They got more business than ever before. So much so that they had to expand their hours. Well, by 1940, with World War II coming and ice going all the way out of business, they decided, well, we're going to have to completely rebrand ourselves, but keep our model of selling ice and food and other things. So they did, and they decided to name themselves after their expanded hours, and the 7-Eleven was born. And today, the convenience store is still one of the first places that people go to buy ice.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, that was amazing. Like thinking about in the book how, I mean, something
Yeah,
so
so the
fun.
bread and the milk didn't come first. It was-
Right.
If it was
That's
ice
so
cream first, I
interesting.
would have had it the other way around.
Right.
Yeah,
It was like built around that.
We wouldn't have convenience stores if we didn't have this.
Was there anything you wanted to include in the book, but you couldn't find a place for?
Well, I would love to have gone more about the history of cocktails, let me tell you.
And I was like, oh no, I have to do a research
Yeah,
trip to
oh,
Weather Up. It's like,
shoot.
I remember Weather Up in Brooklyn. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would like to have gone into more of that, but my editor was like, Amy, we've got to cut you off. The ice can only be so
It
long.
has to, and it has to be about ice. And you're like, well, what if I talk about cocktails
Right.
or they're so tasty?
Or maybe there's another book about cocktails.
Maybe maybe it's iceberg too. Exactly.
I mean, as a writer, how do you approach? I feel like it's amazing how this book like revealed itself to you and was like, hello, I'm the book for you to write, but it was so, you were like looking for this book that didn't exist. How do you, and I don't know if you want to write another book, and I'm not going to do like, what's next thing, but in thinking about how you find things to write about, did this book, did the project of writing this book and discovering this idea and developing it, like change your relationship to looking for ideas?
Yeah, it did. Before I started writing this book, I never thought twice about ice.
No.
The only time I thought about it is when I ran out.
Yeah,
Right,
And I was
exactly.
very frustrated. And what this book revealed to me is that the most common ubiquitous substance can, if you really look at it, where it came from, it can completely change how you see history, how you see the origin stories of some of the most important people and industries in the world. And I think that probably, going forward, I'm going to take a similar approach. Look at what I'd never really considered before and get curious about it and see what it reveals to me about the world.
Yeah. Do you find like, now that you know so much about ice, do you have this like hyper awareness of it? And like, do you love ice now?
I love it, and I also have a lot of gratitude for it. I see it everywhere.
Yeah.
I myself at the gas station. I always stop and just like, oh yeah. I never would have given a second thought to it. Yeah, friend. But now instead of just seeing a freezer full of bags of ice, I see an entire 200-year-old history, and all the people that dedicated their careers, lost their careers, their lives, to making it possible for us to have ice at any time. And yeah, just immense gratitude for all of that history.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a
Yeah.
great place to start.
Thank you.
You all are, yes, thank you.